In 1983, one man looked at a screen that said nuclear missiles were incoming. He had less than 15 minutes to decide whether to end the world. He decided not to. That decision alone kept the Cold War from turning into a nuclear war. But it wasn't the only time. Throughout modern history, humanity has come terrifyingly close to destroying itself, not through grand conspiracies, but through small, almost laughable mistakes. Some of these moments were buried in classified files for decades. Others were nearly forgotten entirely. Here are 7 of them. Chapter 1. The Crash Nobody Was Supposed to Survive. On January 21, 1968, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber was flying a routine Cold War patrol near Greenland, carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, each one far more powerful than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. This mission was part of a program called Chrome Dome, which kept nuclear-armed bombers constantly airborne in case the Soviet Union launched a surprise attack. Partway through the flight, a fire broke out in the crew cabin after a seat cushion was placed too close to a heating vent. Within minutes, thick smoke filled the cockpit, making it almost impossible to see the instruments. The crew had no choice but to eject, leaving the aircraft to fly on without them. The bomber eventually crashed onto the sea ice near Thule Air Base, and on impact, the conventional explosives inside the bombs detonated, though without triggering a nuclear explosion. Radioactive plutonium scattered across the ice in a fire that burned for hours. Cleanup crews recovered debris from 3 of the 4 weapons. The 4th bomb was never found. It's still out there, somewhere beneath the frozen water to this day. The cleanup operation, known as Project Crested Ice, lasted nearly 8 months and involved over 700 workers who removed contaminated snow and ice by the ton, shipping it all the way back to the United States for disposal. Decades later, some of those workers developed health problems they believed were linked to radiation exposure during the operation, and many spent years fighting for official recognition and compensation. The incident quietly ended the Chrome Dome program altogether, since the risk of flying live nuclear weapons around the clock had finally become impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. The Animal That Triggered a Nuclear Scramble. On October 25, 1962, during the most dangerous week of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a security guard at Duluth Air Force Base in Minnesota spotted a figure climbing the perimeter fence in the middle of the night. Believing it was a Soviet saboteur, he opened fire and triggered the base's sabotage alarm. That alarm was designed to alert nearby bases to a possible enemy attack. But at Volk Field in Wisconsin, a wiring error caused the wrong siren to sound, one that specifically ordered nuclear-armed fighter jets to take off immediately for war. The pilots had been told there would be no drills at that alert level, so they believed World War III had already started. Jets loaded with nuclear weapons were already taxiing toward the runway when an officer sped across the base in a car, waving them down just in time to stop takeoff. The figure that started it all, climbing the fence at Duluth, was a black bear. The base commander later admitted that if just 1 more minute had passed before the mistake was caught, at least 1 armed aircraft would have been airborne with no clear way to recall it. The entire chain of events, from gunfire to scrambled jets, took less than 10 minutes from start to finish, at the single most tense moment of the entire Cold War. Chapter 3. A 46-cent Mistake. On the night of November 9, 1979, computer screens at North American Aerospace Defense Command suddenly showed a massive Soviet missile attack in progress, with hundreds of warheads heading toward the United States. Bomber crews scrambled to their aircraft, missile silos were prepared for launch, and the president's own airborne command post took off without him, since there wasn't time to get him aboard. For nearly 6 minutes, officers tried to confirm the data through independent radar systems and found nothing. No missiles, no launches, nothing at all matched what the main computer was reporting. The cause turned out to be a training tape, a simulation of a full-scale Soviet attack that had accidentally been loaded into the live warning system through a faulty computer chip worth less than 50 cents. It later came out that this wasn't the only false alarm caused by that same training tape glitch. A similar incident had happened just months earlier, in June of that year, though it was far less severe and barely made it beyond the control room. Following the incident, the United States spent over $1 billion upgrading its early warning computer systems, and a new backup verification process was created specifically so that a single faulty component could never again come this close to triggering a nuclear response on its own. Chapter 4. The night 2 countries almost misread each other at once. As January 1, 2000 began, fears about the so-called Y2K bug weren't just about computers crashing. They extended to military early warning systems built decades earlier, running on code nobody had fully reviewed in years. In Russia, aging radar technology flagged an anomaly that resembled the launch profile of an incoming missile. Understanding protocol, duty officers were required to report any such signal immediately up the chain of command, with no room for personal judgment or delay.
For several tense minutes, analysts worked to determine whether they were looking at a real attack or simply corrupted data from equipment that had never been designed with the new millennium in mind. It was eventually traced to a software and hardware conflict tied to the date change. But for those minutes, an entire nuclear response chain had already begun to move, based on nothing more than a calendar the machines couldn't understand. What made this moment even more unsettling was that both the United States and Russia had agreed, just months earlier, to share early warning data specifically to avoid a Y2K-related misunderstanding turning into something catastrophic. American and Russian officers actually sat together in a joint command center that night, watching each other's screens in real time, largely because both sides privately admitted they didn't fully trust their own systems not to fail. Chapter 5. One Man's Refusal Beneath the Ocean. On October 27, 1962, at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarine B-59 was trapped underwater in the Caribbean by American destroyers dropping depth charges, intended only as warning signals to force the sub to surface. The submarine had lost radio contact with Moscow for days. Deep underwater, exhausted and running out of air, with temperatures inside the vessel reportedly climbing above 45 degrees Celsius, the crew had no way of knowing whether the depth charges were a warning or the opening shots a war that had already begun on the surface. Under Soviet protocol, launching the submarine's nuclear torpedo required unanimous agreement from 3 senior officers on board. The captain and the political officer both agreed to launch. Only one man refused, Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command. His refusal, and his alone, is widely credited as the single reason the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't end in a nuclear exchange between 2 superpowers. For decades, Arkhipov's role in the incident remained almost completely unknown outside a small circle of historians, since the Soviet Union never published the story. It wasn't until the year 2002, during a conference on the crisis attended by former Kennedy administration officials, that his story became widely known to the public, with one historian later calling him quite simply the man who saved the world. Chapter 6. A Rocket Mistaken for a Warhead. On January 25, 1995, Russian early warning radar detected a rocket launched from an island off the coast of Norway, and its flight path looked disturbingly similar to that of a U.S. submarine-launched nuclear missile aimed at Moscow. For the first and only confirmed time in history, Russia's nuclear briefcase, the device used to authorize a retaliatory strike, was activated and physically brought to President Boris Yeltsin. Military officials had only a few minutes to determine whether this was the beginning of a first strike before recommending a response. The rocket was actually a Norwegian scientific probe, launched to study the northern lights. Norway had notified Russia about the launch weeks earlier, but the notice never reached the military officials actually watching the radar that night. The rocket, known as Black Brant 12, was carrying scientific equipment to study the aurora borealis, a purely civilian research mission that happened to share a flight signature eerily similar to a submarine-launched ballistic missile. The incident was only declassified and confirmed years later, and it remains the closest any nation has publicly come to activating a nuclear response outside of an actual conflict, all triggered by a piece of weather research equipment. Chapter 7. The Man Who Said No. Now back to where we started. On September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty inside a secret Soviet bunker, responsible for monitoring the country's satellite early warning system, a job he had only been assigned to that particular night as a replacement for a colleague. Just after midnight, the system reported that the United States had launched a single intercontinental missile toward the Soviet Union. Protocol required Petrov to immediately report it up the chain of command as a confirmed attack, a report that would almost certainly trigger an automatic retaliatory launch. Then the system reported 4 more missiles. Petrov had only minutes to decide. Something about it felt wrong to him. A real American first strike, he reasoned, would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. Against protocol, and risking his own life if he was wrong, he reported the alert as a system malfunction. Minutes later, satellite data confirmed there were no missiles at all. A rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had fooled the satellite into reporting a launch that never happened. Petrov was neither punished nor rewarded for his decision. The incident was kept secret by the Soviet military for years, partly out of embarrassment over the system's failure, and his actions only became publicly known after the fall of the Soviet Union, when a retired general mentioned the story in his memoirs almost by accident. 7 moments, 7 near catastrophes, and in every single one, humanity is still here today purely because one person or one accident of timing happened to go the right way instead of the wrong one. If this kind of stuff messes with your head, that's exactly what Curious Sketchy is about. Subscribe if you want more of it and drop a comment with the next thing you want explained.